Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Wire. My name is Gabe Caligari. We're glad you made it back for this episode as we have a very consequential topic to discuss with you today regarding Saudi Arabia's ongoing negotiations with the United States and the Jewish state to achieve the so-called deal of the century. But first, a quick reminder that FAI is launching its new Genesis project in the coming months. The new open source initiative gives Western Christians the opportunity to receive crisis response training from the Israeli military, recognized globally as the best in the world, so that we might serve the Jewish people and the Muslim nations surrounding her in times of crisis and upheaval. The initiative is designed to grow beyond the scope of just an FAI program, eventually growing to include partnerships around the world with the Israeli government as a means of building the framework for gospel labor among the unreached in the last days. If you're interested in learning more about the Genesis Project, you can browse to genesiscrisisresponse.com and enter your email address to receive updates in advance of the launch of the program. Our first story today concerns the ongoing unrest in southwest Syria, where public demonstrations against the regime of Bashar al-Assad have been spreading and intensifying over the last 2 weeks, now at levels unseen since the beginning of the Arab Spring over a decade ago. Spiking prices, the devaluation of Syrian currency, and political corruption are fueling the protests in the region adjacent to the Israeli border, including Daraa, which was the cradle of the Syrian revolution in 2011. However, this time, the protest movement is also being spearheaded by Syria's Druze population in the province of Suwaida. The Druze, a non-Muslim Arabic-speaking minority concentrated around the tri-state area of Israel, Lebanon, and Syria, took a mostly neutral stance towards the Syrian regime in the early days of the Arab Spring. Their leadership in the latest round of protests shows the changing character of the Syrian opposition, as social and economic conditions are even more severe than they were a decade ago, and the regime's repression even more brutal. Across southwest Syria, protesters have been in the streets on an almost daily basis, chanting for the end of the regime, closing roads, painting graffiti, and attacking offices belonging to Assad's ruling Ba'ath Party. Some Wire viewers may remember that FAI medical teams served in southwest Syria in partnership with the Israeli military in Operation Good Neighbor between 2017 and 2018. We are thinking and praying about friends we left behind there as the regime regained control of the area 5 years ago, and who are yet again caught up in a movement to oust the regime. Time will tell if the protests will devolve into armed conflict for a second time. Our second story takes us to the other side of Syria, where armed conflict has broken out between rival factions in the anti-ISIS coalition. On August 27th, the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, based in the Kurdish majority area of northeast Syria, arrested Abu Kawa, the leader of the Deir ez-Zor Military Council, a Syrian Arab militia based further south. The council was formerly a part of the SDF and fought alongside Kurdish and other Arab factions against ISIS until 2019. But recently, charges against Abu Kawala have increasingly put him at odds with the autonomous government of northeast Syria, including participation in Syria's burgeoning drug trade. His arrest has led to armed clashes between the Deir ez-Zor Council and the SDF, which have killed 40 people over the last 5 days, prompting other Arab factions and even the U.S.-led coalition to warn that the infighting could allow for a resurgence of ISIS in the region and threatens the stability of the multi-ethnic democratic experiment that has been taking place in northeast Syria for the last decade. Finally, our last story of the day concerns a sudden spike in Palestinian terrorism in the Promised Land, even as the government of Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu continues to work with the United States to secure the deal of the century with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. A growing chorus of reports that ongoing negotiations could hammer out a deal in the coming months has led to a surge of both support and opposition across the region, evidenced by a string of deadly terrorist attacks across the West Bank and Jerusalem in the last 2 weeks, including 4 on Thursday alone. 2 car-ramming attacks, a stabbing attack, and an exploding bomb killed 1 off-duty IDF officer and 1 civilian, also injuring 8 other Israeli troops and another civilian that day. Back on August 21st, an Israeli father and son were killed in the West Bank town of Huwara, while an Israeli kindergarten teacher and mother was shot to death in her car while her infant daughter was in the back seat. While terrorist attacks emanating from the West Bank continue to escalate, militant factions in the Gaza Strip have also begun organizing along the Gaza border fence once again, attacking Israeli troops with rocks and homemade explosive devices from across the border, as Gazan factions announce the resumption of the weekly so-called right of return marches across the border. The fact that a simultaneous uptick in violence from both the West Bank and Gaza last week coincides with news of a possible Israeli-Saudi peace deal has not escaped the notice of many analysts who have warned of Iran's growing influence and patronage of jihadist organizations across the Palestinian territories, and who are now believed to be using their Palestinian proxies in an attempt to spoil ongoing peace talks. However, it would seem that the Palestinian Authority, or PA, led by the Fatah Party and President Mahmoud Abbas, may be favorable towards the deal of the century, depending on the benefits secured for the PA in a potential deal. Abbas's government has increasingly lost its grip on the West Bank over the last year, as the growth of militant organizations such as Hamas and Islamic Jihad has surged in larger cities such as Nablus and Jenin. Formerly opposed to any Arab-Israeli peace deals as part of the Abraham Accords, Abbas now sees an Israeli-Saudi deal as means of enriching and stabilizing his government. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and his ministers have repeatedly named the resolution of the Palestinian issue as a key part of any deal with Israel, even expanding the role of the Saudi ambassador to Jordan to include the so-called State of Palestine, and offering to resume generous payments to the PA government after a 7-year hiatus in cooperation with the American government in 2016. Saudi government officials have gone as far as to suggest that bin Salman, known by his initials MBS, wants to end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict with a, quote, great peace deal that could, quote, finally include a change in the Middle East into a new Europe. The so-called deal of the century has certainly been a priority for Bibi Netanyahu, whose ultra-conservative government faces increasing opposition from both Israeli Arabs and more liberal Jewish Israelis at home, as intra-Arab crime continues to skyrocket and as public opposition to his government's judicial reform efforts in the Knesset continues to percolate. All the while, both Israel and Saudi Arabia face increased pressure from a resurgent Iran, now exporting 1.5 billion barrels of oil per day to nations like China, the highest levels in 5 years since U.S. President Trump withdrew from the Iranian nuclear deal in 2018. A recent threefold increase in oil revenue has eased the Iranian government's economic strain and has reinvigorated its nuclear program, as pressure to reach a deal on the program for sanctions relief is no longer urgent for the Ayatollahs in Tehran. Taken together with growing instability along Israel's borders in Syria and Lebanon, internal political and social divisions in Israel, and the seemingly imminent collapse of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, it would appear that the geopolitical stars have been providentially aligned for just such a deal of the century between the Jewish state and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which is the custodian of the two holiest sites in Islam. In fact, Prince bin Salman has even suggested that the Saudis could take over for the Jordanian government as custodians of the Al-Aqsa Mosque atop the Temple Mount. If this were to happen as part of or subsequent to an Israeli-Saudi peace deal, it would have massive implications, not only geopolitically but prophetically, as it could open the door to Jewish worship on the Temple Mount. Although it is yet to be seen whether such a development will be included in the peace deal, no one can deny that events in the Middle East are on a clear and short path to the end of the age. Now is the time, as disciples of Jesus, for us to make sure that we have oil in our lamps, and that we are investing our talents in the work of completing the Great Commission among the unreached and unengaged in this generation. As always, we love you all. Blessings to you, and Maranatha.